Welcome everybody to the final seminar in the WEFI series this fall. Format is the same as usual. We are happy to have Sabrina Howell here presenting some work on R&D in the US defense industry. And we've got the pleasure of Dan Gross here to discuss the paper afterwards. I think everyone knows the general format. Just a reminder, we're going to default to the chat. There may be a co-author signing on soon, but David and I are here to see the chat questions, and Sabrina will pause every once in a while. We may ask you to unmute and ask your questions if it's sufficiently sophisticated and we don't understand it. With that, I'm going to hand the floor to Sabrina.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and I'm really looking forward to Dan Gross's comments. He's actually helped on some aspects of this project already. I'm not sure if he knows that, but I'm looking forward to more help. So this is called Opening Up Military Innovation, Causal Effects of Bottom-Up Reforms to U.S. Defense Research. It's joined with Jason Rathje, whose excuse for not being here is that he is actually doing defense R&D at the Air Force. John Van Reenen, whose excuse for not being here is that he is talking to the UK Finance Minister about our project today. And Jun Wong, who is my former research scientist and recently started a PhD at the econ department at UChicago. So watch out for him. And his excuse is that he's in finals season. So I'm here alone, but I will try to keep an eye on the chat and will and please interrupt me if you do have questions. Okay. So the motivation for our project, sort of primary motivation, is thinking about the design of incentives for innovation. One relatively overlooked but really important choice to mention when an institution is searching for new ideas is between a centralized or top-down approach in which the funding institution solicits a particular technology, and a more open bottom-up approach in which innovators suggest ideas sort of to the funding institution. The motivation for a bottom-up innovation policy is that the institution may be uncertain about what opportunities exist. And we can imagine this is especially useful if in a larger and more diverse economy, it's become more difficult for technology deploying institutions to find innovations. This problem is particularly salient at the US Department of Defense, which I'll call DoD from now on. Here, innovation procurement has historically been narrowly specified, very top-down, and siloed in a small group of defense firms. In a preliminary analysis that I won't have time to share with you today, but I think is actually quite interesting in the paper, it's a descriptive, sort of some novel descriptive analysis. We show that, in fact, the US defense sector has become less innovative compared to the rest of the economy since the early 1990s. And this is coinciding with extensive M&A activity since the end of the Cold War that has consolidated the defense industrial base. From the Department of Defense's perspective, and this is something that they view, that is a public explicit perspective, it's problematic if the best technologies are no longer marketed to the military. And from a social perspective, we may be worried if DoD plays an attenuated role in funding frontier ideas to the degree that we think that it is a really important funder of these frontier ideas in our innovation ecosystem, which I'll talk a little more about. So what we're going to do in this paper specifically is study some specific reforms at the US Air Force that started in 2018. And they were reforms to the Small Business Innovation Research Program, which I'll also talk about more, but is an innovation program at all agencies of the US government that do R&D, where these agencies have to put a certain % of their funds into this small business, these sort of small business allocations. And what they did, these open reforms, is they said, okay, firms can come and propose any idea or technology that might be useful to the Air Force. And it was explicitly premised on the idea that it's become harder for the Air Force to find ideas in the economy that are relevant to its changing activities. Particularly, we're thinking about software, cyber, being much more important to what they're doing. The conventional program, how they always did it, sort of identifies specific needs for incremental improvement. So for example, they might ask firms to develop higher quality silver paint for airplanes. Both of these approaches are going to focus on the applied or development stage of R&D and on firms that already have a technology and will develop it further, and especially for military use. So do not think about developing the nuclear bomb or basic science. The military does a lot of R&D, supports university research. But this is not what we are studying here is not that. And the vast majority of government funded R&D around the world is this development downstream stage. As scientists ourselves, I think we all are sort of focused on this more upstream basic stuff. But today we're talking about this sort of thinking about applied development. And therefore, the goal of these programs, it will be intuitive to hear, is really to commercialize new technology in DoD and in the private sector. So that is also really important to understand, that contrary to what you might initially think, the DoD actually really wants to build a strong private industrial base outside of the military industrial complex, because they believe that when the time comes, they will need to draw on that American industrial base, and that only having a strong industrial base will allow America to have military supremacy in the long term. So it's a very long, they take unlike many of our politicians, they actually take a very long-term view, and private sector commercialization is a principal goal of their R&D programs. And I want to stress that because they're going to be some of our outcome variables, and that's by design. So the difference between these conventional and open programs is really which agent is identifying the problem, the firm or the government. And the two programs, by studying them, we can kind of start to think about the importance of having sort of efficient search for new technologies. So we're going to use administrative data to compare these open and conventional programs, which were run simultaneously and with the same review process, and therefore make some initial progress towards comparing bottom-up versus top-down R&D policies. We ask three questions. First, did the open program attract new entrants to the overall market in the sense of young firms, and to the defense SBIR market in particular? This was a goal of the program, and the answer is yes. Second, what is the causal effect, conditional on the firms who select in? What is the causal effect on innovation and non-SBIR DoD contracting outcomes? And we find the strong positive effect for open and no effect for conventional, either during the period when they were both being run together, and also during the full period of conventional long before open. Finally, beyond sort of this selection aspect, is there a degree to which the bottom-up nature of open is sort of inherently important to its success? And I'll show you some evidence suggesting that it is. So before I really get to talking about the data and the paper, I want to talk a little bit about our motivation and contribution beyond this top-down, bottom-up starting point. So defense R&D and the SBIR program in particular is a really important and interesting setting. There is a dual use aspect in the military jargon to defense technology, which means it can be both used by commercial applications and by the military. That means large spillovers to the private sector when you have effectively a blank check. And indeed, the DoD has been historically a key funder and early customer, so on the applied development side, for transformational technologies. I developed a really long list at some point, but it's just some things you may have heard of include GPS, crypto, jet engines. So DoD is one of the largest single investors in R&D in the world and accounts for about 60% of US federal R&D. And the program that we study, this SBIR, or the military calls it SBIR, everybody else calls it SBIR, but the military calls it SBIR, is among the largest and most influential government small business innovation programs with many programs, in particular the, I want to call it the Torch program in China. One of the major Chinese government grant programs is also modeled on SBIR. And it's about 3.1 billion across 11 federal agencies when our data starts. And of this, the DoD accounts for 1.3 billion, and the Air Force, which is our setting, has the largest single program in government at $664 million a year. So this is real money. We're going to study government as a customer rather than a regulator or financier, which I think is interesting. Most of the research, much of research on innovation policy, including my own, is really on those latter two dimensions. But government as customer is important in the US and arguably more so in other countries. And then, moving to sort of the broader implications of our top-down versus bottom-up, this is a question that's relevant not just in the military, but for a wide range of public and private institutions. Some of the research that's closest to ours looks at NIH, and they have, this hasn't been studied, but they have used both investigator-initiated competitions, which are like open, and specific requests for applications like conventional. Government agencies around the world use these. The UK has quite a similar program to open, which I think is one reason that they're interested in talking to John about it. And companies are increasingly using bottom-up approaches through customer-driven, outsourced, or open innovation. Okay, so I'm gonna stop there and see if anyone has any questions.
Sabrina, one question. Is whether foreign firms can propose, can be part of this process, or is it restricted to US firms?
Yes, they have to be US owned and domiciled. I see, okay, let me open the chat. Oh, I see.
Yeah, so you see the question by Chris Eaglin there.
Are there broader implications in terms of job creation, quality of patents, or regional diversity? So I'll talk about patents. We don't look at job creation, and we don't look at diversity. I think those are interesting outcomes. They are not goals of the program. And so I think we want to kind of stay tightly focused on thinking about innovation sort of as intended by this program, which overlaps with outcomes that economists think are important gauges of innovation. But I fear that job creation and diversity would start to sort of lead us to wind up casting sort of unlimited net of outcomes that are interesting. I will say Congress cares about job creation and diversity from the SBIR program, but it's not super clear that the agencies do, nor probably the best way to create jobs is not to fund high tech startups, but rather something like infrastructure. So anyway, it's unfortunately not an outcome that we'll consider. The next question is, do we evaluate whether the bottom-up approach causes more idea leakage risk? Do you mind clarifying what you mean by leakage? Do you mean like that other firms or other countries would be able to use US technologies?
So basically now we have more players to propose ideas. And then I guess for the defense departments, they just want to keep some of the most frontier technologies as private as possible to stop, like other countries from following the same direction and then compete in those area, right? I guess it's a sort of like a trade-off.
Yeah, so either way, in both programs, they're working with private firms who have the rights to deploy the technology in the private sector. Now, there are cases in which, and I think ultimately Dan will know more about this than I will, but there are, once a company is selling important technology to the US government, the government can prevent them from selling it to foreign countries and decide which foreign country, like that they can only sell it to friendly governments, for example. And so I think that is related to selection into these programs. So if the startup, really wants to be able to sell their technology to anybody, then, it might become a problem. But there's actually, I think, like less limitation than people sort of typically imagine. The US has a very much like sort of a privatized and outsourced defense, industry to a large degree, much more than other countries, where our the equipment, the software, everything is sort of a lot of it is provided or procured from private industry, with Lockheed Martin or Boeing being names you've probably heard. And these are what we're looking at is going to be sort of smaller companies, but in that industry. And those companies are selling overseas, and there is a lot of leakage. And I don't know that there was ever a decision made, but I think in a large sense, there's a trade-off that the US has made since World War II about trading off some of that idea leakage you're talking about with the benefits of competition and private sector innovation. Okay, yes, Dan will have other thoughts on this. Okay, so I'll move to talking about our setting. So we're going to use administrative data on more than 21,000 applications and evaluations of Air Force SBIR proposals between 2003 and 2019. Much of our analysis focuses on 2017 to 19, when these two programs were run simultaneously. And we're going to focus on what are called phase 1 awards in the SBIR program, which are the vast majority of awards, which are small awards that fund proof of concept work. And winners of phase 1 can go on to apply to larger phase 2 awards. And there, particularly for this period, the sample is much smaller for those phase 2 awards, and we're not going to be able to really find much there, but we're going to find some really interesting effects of phase 1. So our analysis is mostly limited to phase 1. The way the SBIR program works is that firms have to be small to participate. So consolidation is not really a primary concern. And instead, the insularity that I mentioned as being a major concern and motivation for DoD in starting this program is that there's lock-in, where incumbent contractors repeatedly apply and win many contracts, often disparagingly called SBIR mills, seem to rely on it for revenue and don't seem to produce technology that's actually useful for military operations. And so that's really the problem that they were trying to address with this open reform. There are no classified or secret SBIR topics or projects. So there's lots of stuff that happens that's secret, I am sure, at DoD, but this is not in that category. So the way that the process works is that the Air Force issues a public solicitation request for proposals on one or more topics, and each topic is a competition. So firms apply to a specific topic. Multiple government evaluators independently score each application on technology, team, and commercialization quality. Then those 3 subscores are summed, and the winners are the firms whose overall score are above a threshold determined by the amount of funding available. So importantly to our estimation design, the treatment or award is exogenous to the running variable or score. The scores and loser identities are never public. We observe them, but they are not public. Only a loser firm knows that they lost, but nobody else does. So before I get into a little bit more about econometrics, here's sort of some interesting evidence about selection. So this shows coefficients from multinomial logit regressions on characteristics of participants, with the conventional program being the benchmark. And most of the data in these blue dots for the open program, but then we also consider in supplementary tests 2 other reform programs, NSIN and Pitch Day, in order to, as part of a test to see whether sort of the bottom up mattered independently of selection. And so the first thing to take away from this chart is that the open firms in the blue circles are, really different from the conventional firms. They are younger and smaller. They're more likely to be in a VC hub city, less likely to be in an Air Force base county, much less likely to have previous DoD experience, less likely to have patents or awards, much more likely to have previous VC and be a software company. So they're really quite different, but they are similar to the firms that were attracted by these other reform programs that also sought to attract Silicon Valley startups. So what we're going to do to assess the causal effect of these programs is first is run kind of two very similar regressions. One is projecting an outcome on winning, the rank being above 0, or I'm going to normalize the rank within the competition at 0. So ranks above 0 are winners and below 0 are losers. And then I'm going to control for the rank on either side, sort of flexibly around the cutoff for whether you previously won. Although I'll show you the results are not sensitive to this control or lots of other controls. And then we're also in kind of more interesting models is that we're going to interact everything on the right-hand side with a vector of program types to see whether winning is significantly different in the different programs. So Kyle asks, what is the underlying sample at risk here? And I guess, do you mean like who is participating?
Yeah, sorry, I meant for the last slide when you were showing the logit results. Is that all conditional on ever applying to anything? Right, like you don't have people that, it's not like there's not like some raw population underlying this, right? Good question. No, this is only applicants into the programs that we are studying who applied. They could have won or they could have lost, everybody's included, but they applied between 2017 and 19. And the base group is the conventional. Does that, okay. So it's not, we're not, there's no like universe of small firms or something that we're, I guess that's, so it's only those that applied to the SBR program at the Air Force, but conditional on applying, it's all of them. Yeah, okay, that makes sense. Just being clear. Thank you.
Okay, Jen, are you here? I think Jen is going to join, but he's not here yet. Okay. Okay. So this gives you just a sense of what the raw data look like for an RDD like this. These are 4 topics, 2 conventional and 2 open. And you see the total score, that's the sum scores of these 3 independent evaluators. And, there's a cutoff, and the guys who have scores above the cutoff are winners. So the probability of win is 1. This only takes 2 values, or sorry, for each point. And then everybody below is 0. So this is a really sharp RD. The first thing I want to show you that as evidence that this is sort of identifying something causal is to document that baseline covariates are continuous around the cutoff, which is which is I think a really important thing that doesn't always get done. So this shows things like firm age, employment, whether the firm is software or hardware. And you can see that, the open firms are much more likely to be software, but they're not necessarily selecting, the software firms at a higher rate. So that's quite important, all of these. To the point about diversity, this is not a graph that they love, but it, shows that the probability of being a minority-owned firm is continuous around the cutoff. VC having a patent before the decision. And then here are the previous the pre-award outcome variables. So for example, having a DoD non-SBR contract, the conventional guys are more likely. Conventional guys also more likely to have an SBIR contract before the award. The last identification chart I want to show you is a test for manipulation showing the density of applicants around the cutoff. Open is a smaller sample, it's a bit noisier, but there's sort of, in both cases, no evidence of major bunching around the cutoff. Okay, so now let me show you some results. These charts show plots of coefficients from a regression where we're omitting the rank -1 and then saturating the regression with indicators for all of the other ranks. And then I'm only showing you the 4 ranks on either side of the cutoff. And what we see is on the right side of the cutoff, there seems to be an increase in the chances of winning
in open. And with some evidence, that one reason it's important to control for rank, the higher rank guys, are doing even better, but definitely seems to be a causal effect of winning over here. Whereas really there's no effect of winning on VC in the conventional program. When you show this in a regression analysis, including all the controls I showed you in the equation, we see that open increases the probability of VC by about 5 percentage points, around 60% of the mean. And conventional has no effect in our analysis period 2017 to 19, or in the long term, 2003 to 19. And the open program is significantly more effective than the conventional program. So here is the effect on non-SBR DoD contracts within 24 months. The open effect is a little bit noisier, but still seems to be there and is very strong in the regression results. And again, no effect in conventional. Here's the effect on patents. This one is particularly striking for open. We see strong positive effect on having a patent within 24 months after the award, no effect for conventional, and that is borne out in the regressions. And then when it comes to subsequent SBIR contracts, which is really the way we're thinking about lock-in or insularity, that rather than going out and selling in the private sector or selling to DoD mission programs, instead just coming back for another SBIR award, which is not what DoD wants, we see that winning a conventional award seems to breed more conventional awards with a really strong causal effect, and there is no effect for the open program. Now, of course, this is early days, and I think we could see the open program develop insularity going forward. We can't, of course, answer that right now, but thus far it doesn't seem to have done that. And here we have 4 years here after the start of the program, and we're seeing sort of no evidence of this lock-in effect. So we find that winning an open competition has significant positive causal effects on future innovation, VC and patenting, and on translating this R&D into military technology, non-SBR DoD contracts. And I want to emphasize with the patenting that this is an important way to measure innovation, regardless of the type of firm, right? If it's a big public company, an old for-profit R&D lab. So you might think, well, like the VC is really about selecting high-growth startups, and maybe these older for-profit labs, aren't at hazard of VC. And so that's really conditional on selection. But if that were true, we should expect to see an effect on patents in the conventional program. And what I showed you was just really striking positive effect in open, but not in conventional. So we think that open topics might work because the firms are bringing an existing idea oriented primarily to the civilian market to an Air Force customer who didn't know that they needed that innovative product. And we think the large effect on VC in particular reflects open contracts, representing an entry point to much larger DoD contracts. All right, let me now move to some evidence about the mechanism. So is the success of open related to bottom-up openness, or is it about the composition of applicants' selection or some other feature? So the selection story is that is that open attracted firms with larger treatment effects, right? So our results are just explained by attracting firms with larger treatment effects. So this is definitely playing a role. It's a really important part of the story, and achieving this different selection was a major goal of the program. However, we find that entrant status and technology type don't fully explain the results in a heterogeneity analysis. And furthermore, we look at particularly, so for example, for patents, like having startup characteristics isn't driving our results. We then look at other program reforms that I mentioned that also attracted new entrants, as you saw in that selection graph, but those were not bottom up. They were more top down, and we see no effects there. So we conclude that selection, again, is important, but it doesn't seem to be the whole story. So then we're going to look for some evidence that this decentralized bottom-up approach is also increasing the treatment effect. And we ask, and one way to do this is to say, well, within the conventional program, specific topic, stronger effects. So what we do is we score the conventional topics going all the way back to the beginning of our data on non-specificity. And we do this using a natural language processing algorithm to classify applications via words in the proposal's abstract, creating these embeddings. And this is useful because it allows you it basically identifies words that are conceptually similar as the same, as close and the same. And then what we do is we calculate the within topic dispersal of these embeddings so that are an idea. So that's like a happiness idea that would also encompass joy effectively. And then we see, what is the sort of within topic dispersion of proposal embeddings across applications. And so if there's more dispersion, then we argue that that topic is less specific, has a higher non-specificity score. And if John ever comes, he can go into great detail about this. Okay, so what we find is when we interact within the conventional program, and now you see the sample is much larger because we're using all this data historically, we interact winning with non-specificity for patent outcomes. And we see that the causal effect of winning is strongly increasing in this non-specificity outcome. So both for having any patent, which is the outcome that I showed you before, and then also for patent-based quality metrics that we use sort of in the literature, high citations and high originality. So it seems like when conventional was more open, it had a stronger positive effect. And this is above median, by the way, non-specificity, this sort of score, but it is sort of similar using alternative forms. So the last thing that we do is a very simple cost benefit analysis. So we think about the Air Force's objective function as being a weighted sum of military benefits and non-military benefits. And then of course they have to pay some costs C. And we're gonna simplify and think about this being a function of sort of the dollar value of the non-SBR DoD contracts and the dollar value of VC together with some sort of unobserved benefits. We're gonna ask, for the next competition, sort of which program should Air Force pursue? What are the benefits of running these different programs? And we just assume 1 winner and 5 losers for simplicity, but it's obviously easy to expand. And that losers are important, right? Because they create some cost to administration. And then we use our estimated causal effects and the average contract values, as well as Air Force's estimated costs, abstracting from unobserved benefits. And so here's the VC coefficient for open, VC coefficient for conventional, the non-SBR DoD contract coefficient for open, and then the non-SBIR DoD conventional coefficient 3.3. We have an average contract size, which is remarkably similar. This is just sort of luck, but the average subsequent VC in 24 months, if they get it, is about $11 million versus 11.8 million for the contracts, DoD contracts. And then we assume they're sort of weighted equally. We can obviously do that similarly. We know the cost of running the program, and what we get is that there's this pretty large benefit, about $1 million to open, and effectively zero for running a conventional program. And we do a lot of different sort of alternative assumptions here, and you can run this a lot of different ways. And you just get a much larger benefit from the open program. So that sort of suggests that while we're not saying that necessarily they should eliminate the conventional program, there are definitely unobserved benefits and costs that we're not seeing. But at least in terms of the benefits that the DoD has outlined to us that are important goals. They point at least to continuing the open program to being really useful. So in sum, there are trade-offs in innovation investment between decentralized bottom-up and centralized top-down strategies. And
we argue that these open reforms seem to have benefits both for DoD and the private sector. On the selection front, they're reducing barriers to entry. They seem to be reducing these lock-in advantages for incumbents, attracting a wider range of firms. And we also argue that the openness seems to play a role where the firms get to decide, be more sort of creative and come up with their own solutions to DoD's problems. Now, as I mentioned, as our sort of secondary motive, U.S. military R&D is a key exhibit for supporters of sort of mission-driven, innovation-based industrial policy. And there's been sort of this policy discussion about a faltering innovation in this sector. And I think one contribution of this paper is to present, to our knowledge, the first causal evaluation of a defense R&D program that is also relevant beyond defense, as custom companies and other institutions are using bottom-up approaches. And so if you have one takeaway from this talk, it's that innovation funders can benefit from more bottom-up, decentralized approaches. So thanks very much. And Dan's comments.
Great. Thanks so much, Sabrina. Dan Gross is our discussant. You have the 15 minutes.
Wonderful. It is great to be here. Hold on, I'm going to get you all in a gallery mode so I can see some friendly faces on my big screen on my side. Okay, wonderful. So I presume you can all see the screen I'm sharing. It's really great to be here. First, see some faces I saw a few days ago. Good to see you all again, and also folks I haven't seen in a while. And especially here talking about this paper, because it's close to interests of mine. And of course, it's always interesting to read work by Sabrina and John and Jason and June. So let me walk you through some of my own thinking on this paper. And actually, what I'm going to do is start out with a story. This is the story of the Coyote Magnetron. So you might first be wondering, what the hell is this thing? The Coyote Magnetron is a device that propagates microwave radiation, so high power shortwave microwave generation. It was invented by two academic physicists in England in 1940. At the time, magnetrons had been under development in the US, the UK, the USSR since around 1910, since basically the development of the triode. And this one in particular, however, was different because it generated more radiation with more power at shorter wavelength, and it basically made accurate radar detection possible. Now, a device like this at the time would have had enormous potential value to the US military. And, as a lot of you know, a lot of my work has been historical, and it's part of why this is on my radar, so to speak. And yet there was one basic problem. The US military didn't have the technology. And moreover, actually even worse, it didn't even know it existed. And so in a nutshell, this is kind of one of the undercurrents of this paper, is that there's technology out there that the Defense Department can benefit from, but it may not know even exists. Of course, this particular example, in this case, the technology had to come to it. And this has been called the most valuable cargo ever brought to our shores by the historian James Finney Baxter. Basically, this was the center of an entire major research program during World War II that changed the outcome of the war. And in this case, it was acquired through technical exchange between the two countries. So maybe not exactly the same example as what we're seeing with the Open SBIR, but it first brings into focus how much valuable innovation there can be outside of the confines of what the Defense Department even knows exists. And so the first problem it has then is getting it. A bit more akin to what we're talking about in this paper is actually distributed innovation, which also took place during World War I and World War II. And this quote from Irvin Stewart, who is part of that World War II research effort, in a retrospective, he writes, "Americans being an inventive people, there's no reason why any small group of individuals should be considered to have a monopoly of good ideas on any subject." And during war, it turns out the public imagination really goes to work on devising instruments of warfare. In World War I, the military was receiving 2,000 technical suggestions per week. In World War II, it was even more. And so OSRD partnered with a separate body to try to evaluate those suggestions and actually forward the useful stuff. So embedded in here is also a problem of weeding out what's useful and what's not. So, it turns out when the public is submitting all their wacky ideas in the middle of a war, the vast majority is garbage. And so finding the needles in the haystack becomes part of the challenge and actually the cost of implementing a mechanism like the ones that we're talking about in this paper, right? And I'll come back to that in just a bit. So again, the deeper current of this paper is exactly what's embedded in this quote. There's no reason why any small group of individuals should have a monopoly over good ideas. And there are two versions that I see of the innovation problem here. One, the traditional version is we have specific military problems in need of technological solutions, but the other is that there's just a lot of innovation happening in the civilian economy that could be of military value, but isn't on its radar. And here at this point, I think I'm really overusing the pun, so I'll stop. And so one is a problem in search of a solution, and the other you could characterize as solutions in search of a problem. And what the paper then has me thinking about is, are these actually two versions of the same phenomenon, just inverted? Sometimes you go problem to solution, sometimes solution to problem. In drug development, we have drug discovery efforts versus repurposing efforts, where you take an existing drug and try to apply it to new indications. Or in the work that a lot of us do here, research, especially in the traditional Kuhnian approach, starts question and hypothesis to data and testing. But I'm sure many folks in the room have actually had projects where they had really rich data, maybe a nice natural experiment, and they went hunting for a question to answer with it. And that's the inverted approach. And we can debate which is more scientifically pure or which one is more productive. But in any case, my point being is that there are different ways to produce innovation. And between all of these, there's a commonality in matching the problem to matching the solution, to matching the problem and the solution together. And so in this paper, one of the ways to think about this is, why don't we let the technology experts, its creators, suggest military applications of what it is they've created? And what would it take for that kind of a partnership to be successful? Don't worry, Sabrina, I'll actually get into the meat of the paper in just a bit. I'm just sharing my contextual thinking on this. So let me push on. Open SBR topics relative to conventional, I see as a bit of a cattle call. Sabrina didn't show, I don't think she showed the text of these in the talk, but you can tell from the text, they're quite generic. They don't specify any particular problem for SBR applicants to try to address. And in some sense, the basic question of this paper is whether this is a good or a bad thing, whether it's good or bad for DoD and its objectives with the SBR program, in this case, Air Force in particular, but really the department. And the motivation for the experimentation with this mechanism are these broader concerns about a declining military industrial base. So the military industrial base, which has supported military technology for about 70 years now, since for the entire post-war period, there are a number of indicators suggesting that it's stagnating. And these come out of the appendix of Sabrina's paper, where on the left we have, for example, an illustration of consolidation among defense contractors. And so the top 8 or so modern day defense contractors have acquired over the course of the past 30 years a number of competitors, especially in the aftermath of the Cold War and the contraction of military demand post-Cold War, which then led to consolidation in the aerospace and defense industry. Another indicator being the propensity to produce exploratory patents, these firms' propensity to. Another way, and even maybe more straightforward way to think about what the patterns of entrenchment in military technology suppliers might be, or to look at some of the data. So I actually have data from the 60s and 70s, and it's really striking. If we go back and we look at who are the top R&D contractors in the 1960s or 1970s, you see Lockheed, Boeing, Rockwell, McDonnell Douglas, which is now part of Boeing, United Technologies, Raytheon. In other words, the exact same companies that are top R&D contractors today. And that just goes to illustrate how entrenched this industry is over the course of, in this case, 60 years. And this is, it turns out, equally a concern for the SBIR program, even though that's small companies, not large companies. So notwithstanding this concern about a declining military industrial base or some kind of entrenchment, and as a result, maybe some kind of innovative lethargy or sclerosis among military R&D suppliers, I'm still left wondering, is there a specific market inefficiency that open addresses? So the declining research productivity of defense contractors, while it may be perhaps happening more rapidly than other parts of the economy, we all are concerned is a more economy-wide phenomenon. These are new ideas getting harder to find thesis, which is of course also a literature that John has a hand in. Now, setting that aside, is there intrinsically some kind of a challenge in, and this gets back to what I was introducing with, in the military's and commercial sector's problem of matching problems with solutions. And like I said, there are some, it seems to me, there are some intrinsic frictions here, where one side knows the problem to be solved, the other has technical expertise, they have to find each other, and then they have to contract, which has its own challenges, especially in an uncertain R&D setting. And the different kinds of theoretical objects that I think would shape how we would think about efficiency here would be where compared advantage in each of these aspects of the innovation problem sits in the DoD side versus the commercial side, as well as the relative R&D productivity of existing versus new R&D suppliers for DoD, and as well as DoD's cost of screening. Because like I said in the beginning with the wartime examples, when you get a flood of ideas from the long tail, you introduce an added cost of actually working through that stack and finding the ones that actually have value. So there's a deeper question to me whether open reduces search costs in the broad sense that I'm describing here, or increases them. And what other channels might there be for efficiency gains? It's a question that I think this paper draws out for me, is where are the inefficiencies in R&D, especially in the SBIR program, procurement, and what can open do to resolve them? Okay. Now, that was all set up. It's a long setup, but that was all set up, at least to hopefully try to fix some ideas and give us some context for thinking about the problems that this paper is grappling with. The question of this particular paper, I guess there are really two questions. Concretely, they are who submits to an open versus a conventional SBIR? And then what is the effect of winning an open versus a conventional on the winners themselves? The approach here is a sharp regression discontinuity using just proposal scores. This is straight out of the Howell playbook. And it's a new opportunity with a new question. And as I said, I think a really interesting question to grapple with, the top-down versus bottom-up. In a nutshell, what we're finding here, what the authors, I should say, are finding, is that the pool of submitters for open are younger, smaller, geographically farther from Air Force bases than conventional. And winning increases the probability of future VC investment, increases the probability of a future non-SBIR DoD contract, increases the probability of future patents, whereas winning a conventional SBIR mostly just increases the probability of winning another one. And this is, in essence, confirmatory evidence of what other observers and I think DoD officials recognize is a bit of a problem with the conventional SBIR program, which is that some firms are just SBIR mills. They make a business, they make a living off of winning and delivering on SBIRs as opposed to doing more. So that's more or less what we've achieved in this paper. Plus, I should add, I'll get to this if we have time at the end of my slides here, some interesting evidence on specificity and exploration of whether open really is the mechanism and how well we can pin that down. And I'll come back to that in just a few slides. So these are in some sense the first order results of the paper. I think this is a great subject, an interesting mechanism, and I hope at this point you can tell why. It's a good setting and delivers some interesting results. And I'm going to jump in now with some comments, and we can think together about what we can do about them or what they mean. The first comment is simply that I wonder to myself whether it's too early to judge the effects of open, because the mechanism was launched in 2018. The main estimation sample runs to 2019. So we basically have 1 or 2 years of open competitions. And I think to me that begs a couple of questions. The first is whether this is a market, or I guess a contest, that is in equilibrium, or maybe firms are still figuring out how to play the game. And so if that's the case, how strongly should we extrapolate from the first year what really is an experimental mechanism where firms may be learning about it? So the proposer pool could change over time as more firms in the economy become aware of the opportunity. The winner pool could change as firms learn how to compete. And for that matter, it does feel a little bit too soon to make claims that open is less likely to produce entrenched competitors, because we just need more time to evaluate that question. If entrenchment is more of a longer run than a shorter run phenomenon. So I mean, I would love to hear Sabrina's thoughts on that kind of a point too. And excuse me, for that matter, also know how Air Force thinks about that question. My second big comment is whether we should be thinking about the effect of winning an open competition as exactly that, or more as like the pseudo effect of winning your first big customer, because we know that these winners are more likely to end up DoD suppliers, and DoD is a huge price inelastic, reliable customer. It's a good customer to have. And so when this happens, the probability of having future contracts shoots up significantly. And then suddenly maybe you're in business. You might invest, you might take out patents, you might attract investment. And from the VC side, the target itself becomes an attractive investment. And it could be, and not being a VC student myself, Sabrina would surely know more about this than I would, but I wonder whether VCs might be investing because of the government customer, that value being rooted in the DoD relationship itself. And for that matter, whether firms are pitching that to investors to begin with. So those are a few comments. I have lightning round comments since we're close to time. I'll just put in, I'll just throw out one of these, and that's the second bullet here. When we see patenting go up, is that innovation versus appropriation? It gets back to my question over here, where maybe now suddenly a patent would be valuable because you have a customer and you want to have exclusive rights to sell the technology. And then in my last 30 seconds or so, what I do want to point out is some of these results near the end of the paper exploring the mechanism, because I think they're super interesting. So the first is, Sabrina didn't show, I don't think she showed the table, but what you're looking at here is some cuts of the data that are looking within conventional SBIRs at Air Force, comparing the effects on winners of winning any award, and then interacted with the specificity, or really non-specificity of the call for applications, and showing that the ones that are less specific are actually more likely to produce some of these outcomes, even for the conventional winners. So that's some of the supporting evidence for the bottom-up interpretation of the paper. Moving to one other table, and this is my last slide, so I'll wrap up here. When it's comparing conventional and open topics, and now we have essentially the same left-hand side, same right-hand side variables, except now the open sample is included too, and there's an interaction for the open sample. The one thing that I'm grappling with, and Sabrina, this is more in the weeds, and so we could talk about this offline perhaps, is why we're not actually seeing statistical differences for open versus conventional specific. Basically, with a horse race between these three, I would expect open to look more like non-conventional, non-specific. So we can unpack that later. I think to save time for others to chime in with comments, I will bring us to a close here and say this is an interesting paper. I think it's a great topic, and I'm glad to see that progress is being made on this front, because I think it as Sabrina made clear, it's of deep value to the military itself. So thanks you all, and look forward to seeing the rest of the comments.
Great, thanks, Dan. Sabrina, it's up to you whether you want to respond a little bit, or just open the floor because we don't have about 5 minutes or so left.
Oh, thanks. I guess I'll just say one thing that I wrote in the chat, which I think is important. It is, it would be very interesting to revisit this in 15 or 20 years, for sure. However, I think it is in particular to guide policy, both in DoD and elsewhere. I think we have enough data to do an interesting analysis, given the type, it's important, the type of R&D that's being done. And I really tried to stress this, and I think probably the paper could do a better job of stressing this, that this is not, long-term basic R&D efforts, but applying a small firm, applying an existing technology for DoD. And so, if this firm doesn't do anything in the next 5 or 10 years, they're not going to survive, right? Like this is, so they have to move things forward with some, market or another, whether that's the SBIR market, the sort of lock into grants, whether it's DoD contracts, whether it's the private sector. We have at least 24 months for every application in the analysis sample. And thinking about doing that applied R&D, and then whether you're going to get outside capital, apply for a patent or get a contract within 24 months, I just don't think is too soon. So I think we're on it's like on the bubble. I think it's not, you're not the first person to raise this, but I actually really think we do have enough time, so would push back on that. All right, I'd love to hear if there are any other general impressions about weaknesses of the paper, honestly, from everybody. We're working on this now, and so it would be really helpful if you have just any comments or questions.
I see a hand up. Just unmute. Yeah, feel free.
Hi, Sabrina, great paper. And I'm just trying to clarify the thing that was going on in the chat between me and some other people as well. So if the evaluators are equal, in other words, they're totally unbiased and you see something. So I would expect that if they say evaluate something at 2, that would have the same effect for the bottom down and from the top down and the bottoms up. But you're saying it doesn't, that the bottoms up actually, creates interest from VCs, et cetera, and patents, whereas for the others, it doesn't. And that's the part I didn't quite understand in the paper. So I was trying to figure out, through this chat, what was going on.
So we're looking at the effect of winning versus losing a competition, right? So imagine you have 10 small firms apply for a grant, and we compare the 2 that win with the 8 that lost and don't get the funds, and don't get the kind of connections and integration into the military kind of ecosystem, right? And so it's just, so it's saying that, winning that award has a positive effect, that they do better. And then controlling for the rank to try to get it at causality to some degree.
But what about the top down? Same thing.
Right. So we're doing that same exercise across 2 different competitions, where in one case, the request for these proposals identified something very specific, like we want you to make better silver airplane paint. And the other competition said, hey, suggest whatever you want that might be useful to us. So they're different, and judging them is obviously going to be a different exercise, as we could imagine if we were judging economics research proposals. But the experiment we have in mind is that you have these 2 simultaneous, very similar competitions. And in one case, all of the firms are proposing to work on a particular widget that DoD has identified. And in the other case, the firms have been told, you come to us. What do you think we Air Force could use that you have?
Right.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think it kind of explains it, but it just says that you're evaluating according to different criteria, basically, in the two competitions.
So no, they're nominally the same criteria, and that's important for our effort.
That's the part that was problematic for me.
I see. Yeah. So I mean, it's pretty, like, there's a rubric, and we have we have the text copied in the paper, but it's basically like, what are the how they deem the quality of the technology, the idea, the team, the whether they can sell it to either private or public sector customers. So I agree, it's, potentially a bit of a different exercise when you're comparing like similar proposals versus different ones, but we're looking within each competition. So it's winners versus losers among a bunch of more diverse proposals versus winners versus losers in the more conventional ones. I guess maybe I can take one more question. David, did you have a question?
I typed it in the chat window. I guess one thought I had is I wonder if these firms that are winning the open competitions have former military personnel on their staff. In other words, it's not that they're out just inventing stuff that the government doesn't know it wants. They actually have people who help them figure out what the government likely wants. And so the differences are, so I think that would kind of support this idea that there are these companies out there who are SBIR mills, and this is a first customer for them. And so they take the existence of the first customer to a VC or whatever. Do you have any sense of that?
Well, so the mill, just to quickly clarify, the mills are the ones that aren't going to VC, the VCs wouldn't be interested in, but instead are just seeking more SBIR grants from DoD and elsewhere. But your question about whether, whether they're employing former military personnel, I don't know, but my guess is that yes, they are. So we show, and there's like a map of this in the paper, that the SBIR mills and the conventional applicants tend to be like much more likely to be located near an Air Force base in like these random cities, in Nevada or whatever.
Among the comparing open winners to open losers, do you see a difference in whether there's military personnel employed at the?
Oh, open winners and losers. No, we haven't done that. We don't see whether I was just sort of conjecturing. I don't know if they actually employ military people. They're not. What you saw is that they are no more likely to have a previous DoD SBIR contract and no more likely to have previous SBIR contracts when looking at open winners versus losers. So I showed that in the sort of continuity of covariate section. But it would be neat. It would be really neat to see who these guys employ. I actually think generally for this sort of SBIR analysis, and government, thinking about government R&D procurement, like I think there's a lot of work has been done at the firms, like some of what I've done. And I think looking at the people, like David is suggesting, could be a really cool project.
Great. Well, thanks again to Sabrina and Dan for a great presentation and discussion. I want to thank, because this is the last one of the fall, I want to thank all the participants, those of you left here, who many of you make this meeting regularly every other week. You provide great feedback for presenters. And of course, this whole thing wouldn't work without folks like Sabrina and Dan, but also the audience members. So I hope you all can come back when we restart in March 2022. We're going to give a couple months for recruiting. Everybody's going to be busy. So look out for an email for call for papers, and we'll see you all in 2022.